burned. The iron seal burned. Mara Voss had pressed her palm flat against the ancient disk of iron-black metal mounted into the stone pillar at the center of the conclave hall, and the thing had lit up like the sun remembered it. The heat moved through her hand, up her forearm, into the hollow of her shoulder, and she did not pull away. Not because she was brave, because she could not move, because the seal had taken hold of her the way deep water takes hold of a stone. Not roughly, not unkindly, just completely, with the patience of something that had always known it would find her eventually. Around her, the hall went silent in pieces. The low roar of 300 assembled wolves, alphas, elders, blood-sworn warriors who had come to witness the monthly showing, dropped from noise to murmur to nothing over the course of perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds was all it took to end 500 years of waiting. She could feel them staring. She did not look up. The seal pulsed once, twice, then sent a sound through the stone pillar that Mara felt in her back teeth, a resonance low enough to be felt rather than heard, the signal every wolf in this hall had been trained since childhood to recognize as the language of recognition, a bloodline claim. An ancient line answering the call it had been born to answer. Her palm should not have been against that pillar at all. She was the hall's physician, the woman who mixed the fever tonics and set the broken bones and kept her eyes on the floor when the alphas processed past. She had been exactly where she was supposed to be, at the side table, near the eastern pillar, organizing the small medical kit she always brought to conclave gatherings in case one of the assembled lords decided to resolve a disagreement the old way. She had stumbled. Carrick Dune, the alpha of the Fifth Reach, had shifted his considerable bulk sideways to address his neighbor without looking, and he had caught Mara with his elbow hard enough to send her 3 steps sideways and her outstretched hand directly into the face of the pillar. Her palm had landed against the seal by accident. The seal had not cared. It sang against her skin now, and the sound it made in the stone was climbing, gaining in frequency, shifting from a private resonance into something the entire hall could hear. It was the sound every wolf in this room had been taught meant impossible. It was the sound that rewrote everything she thought she knew about the life she had made for herself inside her careful invisibility. She was not a healer from a minor family, which was the only thing she had ever let anyone believe. She was not plain and unremarkable, and easily overlooked. She was, if the seal was to be believed, and the seal did not lie. The seal could not lie. 5 centuries of iron tradition had staked itself on the certainty that the seal could not lie. She was something the kingdom had stopped believing existed. And across the hall, standing motionless at the base of the dais, where he had been accepting reports from his regional alphas not 30 seconds ago, the Alpha King Devan Aldrich was looking at her like she had reached into his chest and rearranged something without asking permission. She could feel his attention the same way she had always been able to feel it, without wanting to, without understanding why. Like pressure behind the sternum, like standing near a fire you haven't decided yet whether you're going to move toward or away from. She pulled her hand from the seal. It let her go with a sound like a breath released. The hall was perfectly quiet for one more moment, and then it was not quiet at all. Mara had been 11 years old the first time she had seen the iron seal. Her father had brought her to the conclave hall on a supply run. He was one of the men who maintained the building's stonework, anonymous and necessary and invisible in the way she had eventually taught herself to be, and she had wandered away from him while he spoke with the head mason, drawn by the smell of old stone and something else underneath it, something she didn't have a word for at 11. Something metallic and warm and alive. She had found the pillar at the center of the hall. She had stood in front of it for a long time. The seal was cold then, just a flat disk of dark iron, with old script pressed into its surface. Wolf tongue, the old syllabics, the language her grandmother had taught her in secret, because her grandmother had believed that a girl should know her own history, even if that history was supposed to be forgotten. Her grandmother had told her about the seal, too. Had told her that the bloodline it was calibrated to recognize had been the founding bloodline of the kingdom, and that 500 years ago, during the war that had broken that family into scattered fragments, the seal had gone quiet. The founding line had been scattered. The throne had passed to the next dominant bloodline, the Aldrichs, who had ruled well and ruled long, but who had never, would never, be what the Voss line had been. Her grandmother had whispered this in a small room above a tannery in a border town where no one knew their names, and she had told it to Mara with the specific urgency of someone passing on something that must not be lost, must not be forgotten, even if neither of them would ever see it matter. At 11, Mara had stood in front of the seal and reached out one small hand toward it and stopped herself. She didn't know why she stopped. Instinct, perhaps, or the specific caution of a child who had already learned that remarkable things, if noticed, brought trouble. She had pulled her hand back. She had gone to find her father. She had never stood that close to the seal again. Not until tonight. The years between 11 and 32 had made Mara careful in the way that a hard winter makes a careful forager. She had learned what she could eat and what would kill her, and she had learned to waste nothing. She had apprenticed herself to the pack's physician at 16, spending 6 years learning everything the old woman knew. And when the old woman died, she had taken the position without asking, simply continuing to do the work, because someone had to, and she was already there. No one objected. She was useful and quiet, and she did not make demands. She had built a life the size of what she was allowed to want. She realized at 32, also been lying to herself about one very significant thing. She had been lying about Davin Aldrich. She had met him, properly met him, in a room together, speaking, 3 years ago, when he had come to the hall for his first conclave as king, and she had been called to see to a minor wound one of his guard captains had taken in transit. She had done her work. She had been on her way out when he had said, from across the room, in a voice that was quieter than she'd expected from a man of his reputation, "You did that quickly." She had turned. He was looking at her directly, which men in his position generally didn't bother to do with pack physicians, and there had been something in that direct attention that had caused a specific sensation in her chest. Not a flutter, nothing as light as that, but a heaviness, a sudden weight of recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time and was marking it carefully. "You're welcome," she had said, which was not what she'd meant to say, which was probably something appropriately deferential. She'd been mortified the whole walk home. He had smiled. She had seen it from the corner of her eye as she turned away, small and surprised, like a man who didn't smile easily but had been caught off guard into it. She had made herself forget that smile a minimum of 40 times in the 3 years since. She had seen him regularly after that. The conclave met monthly, and she was always present. And she had done what she did with all things that threatened to disrupt her careful equilibrium, which was to make herself small in his presence, to ensure she was background. Useful background. Invisible background. The healer at the side table. The woman with the medical kit. Not someone the Alpha King needed to notice. He had noticed anyway. She did not let herself think about that. The problem with the mate bond, and Mara had understood since she was old enough to understand anything, that the bond between her and Davin Aldrich was real, was old, was the kind of thing that had been written in both of them before either of them was born, was that it did not require her permission to function. It did not consult her on its schedule. It expressed itself in specific and inconvenient ways, the way she could track his location in any room she entered, the way her hands steadied, specifically when he was present, even if he was 30 feet away, the way the cold that lived in her chest in winter cleared when she could hear his voice, even at distance, even speaking to someone else. She had decided, years ago, that she would carry this like a small injury she had learned to compensate for. She had decided she would not act on it because acting on it required admitting what she was, and admitting what she was would destroy the life she had so carefully built. And now, the seal had decided for her. The hall erupted the moment she stepped back from the pillar. 300 wolves, most of them alphas and senior pack members, all talking at once. The sound was not aggressive, not yet. It was the sound of people trying to make sense of something their categories didn't have room for. She heard her name, or her title. Healer, the pack healer, said in tones ranging from disbelief to the specific high pitch of outrage warming itself up toward action. She heard the old syllabic word for the founding line. It moved through the crowd like a ripple in water, person to person, each saying it as if testing whether it was permitted to be said aloud. She pressed her back against the pillar behind her and stayed there because the crowd had turned inward toward her and she needed the solid stone at her spine while she decided what to do with the next 60 seconds of her life. Make room. His voice came from the direction of the dais, and the crowd parted the way crowds part for kings. Not immediately, but inevitably, the people nearest to him stepping aside in succession, the gap widening until there was a clear space between him and her. Devan Aldrich walked through it without hurrying. She had always been unable to be objective about this, a difficult man to look away from, not because he was beautiful in any conventional way, though he was that too, but because he moved with the specific quality of a person who had decided, very early in life, to take up exactly as much space as he actually occupied, and no more and no less. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that collected lines early and carried them well, and he was looking at her now the way he had looked at her exactly once before, 3 years ago in a side room, with the full force of his attention and nothing reserved. She did not drop her eyes. The old Mara would have. Tonight's Mara, the one whose palm still hummed with the residual frequency of a 500-year recognition, looked back. He stopped 6 feet from her, close enough that she could feel, physically feel, a warmth along the outside of her left arm, the mate bond straining toward him like a plant toward light. "Your name," he said, and she understood from the way he said it that he already knew her name, that he had always known her name, and that this was not a question but a statement of something that had changed. "Mara Voss," she said. "Pack healer, you know my name." "I know your name," he confirmed. "I didn't know your bloodline." "Neither did I," she said, which was not entirely true, but true enough. He looked at her for a moment, not the way he looked at problems. She had been close enough to observe him often enough to know the difference. And then he turned to the hall, and his voice went from the register he used with her to the register he used with 300 people, a slight shift, a deepening. "The seal has spoken," he said. "In 500 years, it has not spoken. What it has said tonight is a fact, and this conclave will treat it as a fact. If anyone wishes to dispute the seal's judgment, they may bring their dispute to me, formally, tomorrow, with documentation." The specific edge he put on the last word made it clear what he thought the odds were of anyone finding useful documentation. The crowd noise dropped to something more manageable. The alphas who had been moving toward her, toward the pillar, toward the situation, stilled. The seal's authority was not a thing wolves disputed lightly. She thought that was the end of it for tonight. She was not yet understanding that nothing about this was ending, that everything was, in fact, just starting, when Elder Graves stepped out of the crowd. He was 70 years old, with the compact strength of a man who had spent decades being dangerous, and he had been the chief elder of the conclave for as long as Mara could remember. He had always been kind to her. He had always asked after her work. He had always made her feel, with small gestures and quiet approvals, that she was welcome in these halls. He looked at her now with something else on his face. "The seal's recognition is not sufficient," he said, and his voice was very calm. The founding bloodline did not merely inherit the seal's recognition. It carried a ritual obligation. The heir must be confirmed by the ritual of the 3 marks, or the recognition is merely. He paused, finding the word with the careful precision of a man choosing a weapon, decorative. She felt rather than saw Devon go still. "The 3 marks," he said. "You're invoking the 3 marks." "It is in the original law," Graves said, "which the seal itself was written under. If the seal answers to the original law, so must the heir." Mara had spent 12 years in these halls. She had read everything she could access. She knew what the 3 marks were. Every wolf with any education in the old law did, and she knew that invoking them in this context was not procedurally incorrect. She also knew what they were designed to do. The 3 marks were a confirmation ritual, yes. They were also, historically, a filter. 2 of the 3 had to be survived. The 3rd had to be chosen. A founder's heir who was not equal to the challenge would not be marked, would be burned, more precisely, by the ritual itself, which used channels of old power that did not negotiate. Graves was not asking her to be confirmed. He was asking her to go stand in front of something that would kill her if she wasn't exactly what the seal said she was. She understood this in the space of one breath. She understood also that everyone in this room was looking at her, and that Devon Aldrich's stillness beside her had gone from political consideration to something else, something more personal, something she recognized because she felt the twin of it in her own chest. Not fear, but the very close cousin of fear, the kind that comes specifically from the possibility of losing someone you cannot afford to lose. She had not let herself be that to him. She had not let him be that to her. The mate bond did not care what she'd let. She looked at Graves, at the man she had brought broth to when he was ill last winter, at the man who had patted her shoulder and said she was indispensable, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, and was in fact something quieter and more permanent than either. "When?" she said. Graves's expression did not change. "The ritual runs on the new moon. 3 days." 3 days. She nodded once, turned to leave, and felt the exact moment when Devon moved to follow her. "Not here," she said, quietly, without turning. "Don't follow me tonight." He didn't. She lay on her back in her narrow bed above the hall's physician rooms and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep, and in the dark the mate bond hummed like a wire under tension, and she pressed her hand against her own sternum and breathed. She had 3 days to become something she had spent 21 years pretending she was not. The first 2 days were worse than she had expected, which was saying something, because she had expected them to be bad. The alphas, who had been cordial to her for years, rerouted their cordiality into a careful, elaborated version of distance. Not hostility. Most of them were too politically careful for open hostility, but the specific distance of people who were reassessing a known quantity and finding the reassessment unsettling. She had been useful and small and known. She was now neither small nor entirely known, and that rearranged every interaction that had previously been comfortable. She did her work. She mixed the fever tonics and set the broken bones, and kept her schedule exactly as it had always been. because the alternative was to show that she was afraid, and she was not going to show them that. Carrick Doone, whose elbow had sent her into the seal in the first place, came to her on the first morning with a broken knuckle he'd gotten in an argument the night before, and sat across from her in the small workroom while she set the bone, and he was so obviously trying to think of something to say about the previous night that she eventually took pity on him. "You didn't know," she said. "I didn't know," he agreed, with the relief of a large man who had been given permission to stop trying to find words. "I'm sorry about the elbow." "You should be," she said. "I have bruises." He looked at her with something new in his expression, something that was not the casual dismissal of the pack healer, but was not yet the deference of the founding heir, but was instead something in between, a genuine curiosity, careful and honest. "Are you frightened?" She thought about lying. She had been lying, in various forms, for 21 years, and it was an extremely functional tool. But she looked at his broken knuckle in her hands, and she thought about the next 30 hours before the new moon, and she said, "Yes." "Good," he said, which was the answer of a wolf who knew that appropriate fear and appropriate recklessness each had their place. "Fear's useful." "I know," she said. "I've always known." She did not see Devon on the first day. She heard him. She could always hear him, in the way she could feel him, at the edges of awareness, moving through the building, doing the work of a king in the middle of a political disruption that was not small. She had essentially handed him a crisis by the specific accident of her palm against that pillar. She appreciated that he was handling it. On the second evening, he was in the corridor outside her workroom when she left. He didn't make it obvious. He was standing against the far wall, not blocking the door, not performing the waiting, just present, in a corridor he could legitimately be in, reading something in a leather-bound document that she doubted very much he was actually reading. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. The mate bond moved through her like a tide pulling out. Not painful, but the specific ache of something that needed to move and was not moving, that wanted connection and was being held back. She could see from his face that he felt it too. She had always been able to tell when he felt it. There was a tightening at the outer corners of his eyes, a slight shift in his breathing, small adjustments his body made to the nearness of her. "You have the documents you needed?" she said. "I have them," he said. He set the document against his side. "Mara." "Don't," she said. She didn't say it unkindly. "Not tonight. I need to tell you something." "Tomorrow," she said. "After, if there was an after." She did not say that part. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had spent 3 years refusing to think about. Not the king's expression, not the political calculation, but the personal one, the one he only had when they were close enough for the bond to make pretending expensive. The one that said she was not background to him, had never been background to him, whatever she had decided. "Mara," he said again. "Devon," she said, and using his given name was the most honest thing she had done in years, the small acknowledgement that she knew what they were to each other, that she had always known, that she was not pretending tonight even if she couldn't afford to stand still. "After." She walked past him down the corridor. She felt his gaze on her back all the way to the stairs. She did not look back. Looking back was for women who had the luxury of knowing they'd return. The ritual chamber was deep underneath the conclave hall, cut from the same volcanic stone as the pillar above, the walls tracing in old syllabics the lineage of every pack that had ever stood before the seal. The torches that lit it were not fire. They were not fire, and they were not light in any ordinary sense, but they were the closest approximation a mind accustomed to ordinary things could make. They burned cold and white and steady, and they threw no shadows, and Mara understood when she descended the stone steps that she was already inside the ritual, that the ritual had begun the moment she chose to come down. She was alone. That was how it was done. The 3 marks required no witnesses except the old power itself. The first mark was the mark of lineage. It lived in the stone floor at the chamber's center, a circular seal, twin to the iron disc above, but old in the way the one above was not, older than the building, older possibly than the language pressed into its surface. She was supposed to stand within the circle and simply be what she was. If the old power found her lineage genuine, the first mark would rise. She stepped into the circle. The cold moved up through her feet and into her legs, and she locked her knees and breathed and waited. The first mark rose. It bloomed from the stone beneath her, like ink into water, old syllabics spreading outward from her feet in every direction, glowing the specific color of new bronze in firelight. She watched them spread and felt, underneath the fear, something enormous and quiet, recognition. Not the seal's recognition of her recognition of something she had been carrying, without a word for it, her entire life. Some orientation, some inheritance, some old sense of obligation that had always been looking for its home. She breathed through it. She walked to the second chamber. The second mark was the mark of cost. It required the heir to hold a channel of old power open without releasing it, to feel, at full volume, what the founding line had felt in the war that had broken it, the full magnitude of the loss, the death of everything that had been built over generations, the fracture. It was not a memory she had lived, it was older than her. But it was hers, the way inherited grief is yours. It came through her bloodline, like water through stone, and when it found her, it did not ask permission. She was on her knees before she understood she had dropped to them. She did not scream. She did not close herself against it. She had spent 32 years being a healer, and a healer's first discipline is to be present with pain without flinching away, to hold space for what is true without making the patient carry your discomfort as well as their own. She held the channel open. She let the loss move through her like weather. She did not disappear into it. The second mark rose from the wall ahead of her, a different script, older syllabics, pressed in deep relief, glowing not bronze but silver. It settled into her skin along her left forearm like a brand that brought no pain, and she understood she had passed through something she would carry forever. She sat for a moment on the cold stone floor. She breathed. She pressed her hands to her thighs and felt her own pulse, steady, and she thought, she did not mean to think it, it arrived the way the bond arrived without consultation. She thought of his face in the corridor, the specific tension at the corners of his eyes. She stood. The third mark was different from what she had expected. The third chamber was not cold. It was warm, lit in the same knot fire that was somehow also amber, and at its center stood a person she did not know and had never seen, robed in old cloth, with a face that was not a face in any way she could explain, not frightening, simply not settled into specificity, wearing the aggregate of many faces the way a roll is worn. The figure said without speaking, which was to say she heard it in the place behind speech, where understanding lives. The third mark is the mark of choice. The founding line carries a burden, the current throne does not. The heir may accept the burden or refuse it. Both are permitted. Refusal does not erase the lineage. But acceptance is not reversible. She had expected a test, a challenge, a fire to walk through. She had not expected to be asked. "What is the burden?" she said. "To hold the seal," the figure said, "not to rule in place of the current king, to hold the seal beside him. To be what the seal requires, present, visible, acknowledged. You will not be invisible again." She stood very still in the amber warmth. For 21 years, she had been invisible by choice, and that choice had kept her safe, and that choice had also cost her every single thing she had never let herself want. It had cost her the mate bond. It had cost her the possibility of being seen. It had cost her Divan Aldrich's hand at the small of her back, and his voice saying her name, and the weight of a life built beside someone who was built for her, specifically the way the seal had been calibrated to her bloodline, specifically. She understood that Graves had sent her here expecting her to burn. She understood that she was not burning. She also understood that the choice being offered to her now was the choice between the life she had made and the life she had been born to, and that these were not the same life, and that she could not have both. "I accept," she said. The third mark settled into her skin the way the second had. Her right arm, mirroring the first, bronze and silver together now completed, and the amber warmth rose and rose until it was simply warmth and not light anymore, and then she was climbing the stone stairs back into the conclave hall, and the old power was quiet inside her, the way settled things are quiet, and the seal above was glowing faintly from 30 feet away, recognizing its air, recognizing her, and she walked out of the hall into the night air and stood on the steps above the torchlit courtyard and breathed. The new moon was absolute darkness above the mountains. She stood in it and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, precisely the right size for herself. She heard him behind her before she saw him. She had always been able to hear him. She turned. Divan Aldrich was standing at the top of the hall stairs, 12 feet away, and he was not wearing the king's public expression. He was wearing nothing on his face that was performance, or management, or containment. She had only ever seen him without those things in specific unguarded moments over 3 years of careful distance, and seeing it now, all of it, his face, simply his face, the wanting without the management of the wanting, was the most disorienting thing that had happened to her in a night that had included several very disorienting things. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right." He let out a breath that was not quite relief, and was not quite anything else easily named. It was the specific exhale of a person who has been holding something difficult and has set it down and is not yet used to the absence of the weight. He came forward, not quickly, but with the quality of a man who had decided something and was not waiting any longer. She stood where she was. He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that the mate bond was not a thing she needed to reach for. It was simply present, the full warm pressure of it, the specific gravity that had lived in her chest for 3 years, and was now, without distance to maintain the careful pretense, exactly as large as it had always been, exactly as obvious as she had always refused to admit. She put her hand against his forearm. The contact was simple, and she had not planned it, her hand simply going to him the way a compass needle goes to north, without drama, without apology. She felt him go still under her touch, the way he always did. Not the stillness of a man caught off guard, but the stillness of one trying not to startle something that had finally decided to be within reach. "You should have told me," he said, quietly. "I know." She did not pretend she didn't. "I was afraid. Of what I would do. Of what it would cost." She turned her hand so her palm was against his forearm, feeling his pulse under her fingers, the warmth of him, the solidity. "My life was small, and it was mine, and I had made it work. If I was what the seal says I am, my life stopped being something I could control. I was not ready to stop controlling it. And now," his other hand came up and covered hers where it rested on his arm, not gripping, just covering, his palm over the back of her hand, his fingers at her wrist where her pulse was doing something complicated. "I went through the 3 marks alone tonight," she said. Graves sent me down there, expecting the ritual to solve his problem for him. It didn't. I'm still here." Something changed in his expression. Not surprise, but the specific satisfaction of a man who has been watching someone underestimate someone else and has been waiting for the correction. "He will contest the marks," Devon said. "Tomorrow, he'll say there's documentation missing, or the marks didn't settle properly, or some procedural—" "Let him," she said. He looked at her. "Let him contest it," she said. "I'm not afraid of him anymore. I spent 21 years being afraid of being seen, and I have had enough of that." She paused. The mate bond was doing something she didn't have good language for. Not singing, not burning, something simpler than either of those. Something like a door that had been closed for a very long time being opened by no more force than a hand. "I am not going back underground, Devon. Whatever Graves does, whatever the council decides, I am done making myself small enough to fit into someone else's comfort." He was very still. "Good," he said, and his voice in that word was the same voice he'd used in the side room 3 years ago. Quiet, surprised into sincerity. "I have been watching you make yourself small for 3 years, and I want you to understand that it has been," he paused, searching, "genuinely painful to watch." She almost laughed, which was the last thing she had expected to do on these steps at the end of this night. And the almost laugh was enough to shift something in both of them. The very last of the managed distance, the remaining careful surface. He raised his hand from hers to her jaw, slow and unhurried, giving her the time to move away if she was going to. She didn't move away. His thumb rested at the edge of her cheekbone, and he simply held her face as if it were something he had been wanting to hold for longer than was polite to admit, which she knew it was, because she had been wanting the same thing, quietly, without permission, for 3 years. She turned her face into his palm. Just slightly, just enough. "The council is going to be a problem," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Graves is specifically going to be a problem." "Yes." He was not moving his hand. "I need you to not try to handle it for me," she said. "Whatever comes next, the challenges, the formal disputes, whatever the council invokes, I need to handle it, as what I am." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him weighing this, feel it through the bond, the slight tension of a man accustomed to managing things being asked to step back. And then he said, "I'll be where you can reach me." "That's what I need," she said. He leaned forward. His forehead came to rest against hers, and she closed her eyes, and in the dark behind her eyes, the mate bond settled into something that was not the taut, unhappy wire it had been for 3 years, but was simply warmth, simple, enormous, present. His breath was warm against her face, his hand stayed at her jaw. She put both her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady, matching into hers, the way it always did when she stopped fighting the bond. The slow convergence, the specific resonance of 2 people built for each other, finding the frequency again. They stood there in the absolute dark of the new moon for a long time. Not kissing, not yet. That was a thing for a room without stairs and political crisis on 3 sides, but simply present, bone close, the bond finally allowed to be what it was without apology. The mountains around the courtyard held the silence. The torches burned below them. The seal in the hall behind them glowed faintly through the stone walls. A warmth she could feel at her back, recognizing, patient, satisfied in the way ancient things are satisfied when they have finally completed what they were made to do. Graves filed his formal contest the next morning exactly as predicted, citing 4 separate procedural objections to the mark ritual, each more elaborately constructed than the last, and each requiring documentation she could not possibly have, because the documentation he cited was from the founding era itself and had been conveniently, lost in the same war that had broken the founding line. She stood before the conclave with both her arms bare, the marks visible from the chamber's edges, and she read the original law back to him. She had spent 12 years in the hall. She had access to every archive the physician's office held, which was significant access, because healers documented everything. Healers were trusted with records other people forgot to guard. Healers were background. She had spent 2 of those 12 years reading the founding-era law texts in the original syllabics, the language her grandmother had taught her, the language she was not supposed to know. She cited chapter, verse, and seal year for each of Graves's 4 objections. She demonstrated, using the founding law's own language, that the documentation he claimed was required had been formally waived by the founding law itself under exactly these circumstances, the circumstances of a contested heir claiming after long diaspora, because the founders had known the diaspora might happen and had written the waiver into the original text against the possibility. The seal's marks on her arms had been written in the same hand as the law she quoted. The conclave voted. It was not unanimous. It was never going to be unanimous, but it was sufficient. 14 alphas in favor, 3 abstentions, 2 against. Graves left the hall without speaking. She found him in the corridor afterward, and she did this deliberately, because she wanted to look at him without the crowd between them. "Elder Graves," she said. He turned. He was old and diminished, and he had the specific look of a man who had made a calculation that had failed, and she had known him long enough to see that behind the calculation was something she had not expected, not malice, but fear. He had sent her into the ritual expecting it to burn her, yes, but he had sent her there because she frightened him, not because he hated her. The world he had organized himself around was a world where the founding line was gone, where the Aldrichs were permanent, where his position within that structure was secure. She had dissolved that world in 4 seconds against a pillar of stone. "You're angry," he said. "No," she said. It surprised her that this was true. "I brought you broth last winter." He blinked. "When you had the fever, I brought it myself, because the junior healers were occupied. You didn't know it was me." She paused. "I was the pack healer. You were sick, and I brought you broth, and I would do it again. That doesn't change." She let that settle. "You sent me into a ritual that could have killed me. That doesn't change either. We can both know what the other is now." He was very quiet. She left him there. Devon was waiting at the far end of the corridor. He had been where she could reach him, as promised. She stopped beside him, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked through the hall together in the bright winter morning, through shafts of pale light that moved across the old stone floor, and the people they passed, the pack members, the junior alphas, the domestic staff, the hall guards, looked at the 2 of them together, and something settled. Something shifted, some piece of the conclave's configuration rearranging itself around a new center of gravity. She was not invisible. She would not be invisible again. The thing she had used as protection had been a cost all along, and she had finished paying it. She was 32 years old, with the marks of the founding line on both arms, and the mate bond, no longer a wire under tension in her chest, but a warmth she moved inside, and she was precisely, at last, the size of what she actually was. 3 months later, on the winter solstice, she held the Iron Seal's formal acknowledgement ceremony in the conclave hall, with 300 wolves assembled, and the torches burning high, and Davin Aldrich standing at her right side, not as her sovereign but as her mate, announced for the first time publicly, the bond between them a thing no longer managed or minimized, but stated plainly in old syllabics for the record. She pressed her palm to the seal a second time. It sang for her immediately, without hesitation, the way something sings when it has been waiting a very long time and has not once doubted the wait would be worth it. The hall filled with that resonance, the deep, certain note of recognition, and this time she did not pull her hand away. She stood there with the seal warm under her palm, and Devon's shoulder solid against hers, and the marks on her arms catching the torchlight, and she thought of a small girl in this hall 21 years ago who had reached toward this same pillar and pulled her hand back. She had needed those 21 years. She had needed to become a healer, to learn the law, to read the old texts in the language her grandmother had preserved, to build the competence that would make her capable of standing in front of graves and citing chapter and verse, to dismantle everything he had constructed, to unseat her. She had needed every year of it. She had also needed this, to be finished with hiding, to have the hiding cost enough that she would not slide back into it the moment things became difficult again. She turned to look at Devon, and he was looking at her, had been looking at her, she suspected, since she stepped forward to the pillar, the full attention without reservation. The king's expression and the man's expression collapsed into one because there was no longer any reason to separate them. She had spent 3 years turning away from that look. She met it now and held it, and the mate bond moved through her like breathing, like something so ordinary and so essential that the world organized itself around it without effort, the way the hall had organized itself around the founding line's return, the way the seal had been waiting, the way she had always known, underneath the hiding, underneath the caution, underneath every year of carefully cultivated smallness, that she had been made for something that was not small at all. She had not reconciled with the fear. She had not forgiven herself for 21 years of it. Those were different questions, and she would work through them in her own time, at her own pace, as herself. But she was here. The seal knew her. The marks were hers. The man beside her had waited 3 years in corridors with documents he wasn't reading, and she was done making him wait. She turned from the seal, slid her hand into his, and in the full, torchlit assembly of the conclave hall, in front of 300 wolves and the long memory of old stone, Mara Voss of the founding line came home.